What's up guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here then welcome to our little corner of the internet. Today we are diving into a lot of history. Today we're going to be watching a video on the entire history of the British Empire. I'm quite excited. I feel like I'm learning a lot, and I have never heard of the entire history of the British Empire. I do know that kind of how it fell, because we watched the video on how the empires kind of fall apart and what are the steps they go through before that happens and blah, blah, blah. But I've never heard of the whole history of the British Empire, which has been quite a thing. So let's see what this video is about.
If you were to look at Britain on a map today, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its borders only encompass.
Guys, this is a note to my own subscribers. Guys, what is that voice? What is that voice? It sounds like it's coming up straight out of a computer. I don't know if you can do 22 minutes of that. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Okay.
If you were to look at Britain...
I'm so sorry if that's actually someone's voice and it's just a microphone. I'm so sorry. It just sounded very metallic.
If you were to look at Britain on a map today, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its borders only encompass those of the British Isles. But if you look at the world as a whole, you will find that there are actually 14 overseas territories where the British government still holds power. From
Gibraltar is pretty close to where I live in Spain, so I've been there. It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting how it's in different parts of the world.
Gibraltar, at the entrance of the Mediterranean, to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. These are the last remaining possessions of Britain's once mighty empire. At the height of its territorial control, a little over 100 years ago, the British Empire covered 1/4 of the globe's landmass, and
it's not even that long ago. Sorry, I'm not going to stop all the time, but a little over 100 years ago, that's not even long ago. That's like 2 lifetimes ago, 1.5 lifetimes ago. How crazy is that?
Ruled almost a third of the world's population. It was the empire on which the sun never set. But how did such a small island nation become the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen? This is the history of the British Empire.
I love the intro.
The foundations of the British Empire were laid long before the state of Britain even formally existed. The dominant power in the British Isles throughout much of its history has been the Kingdom of England. With a well-developed economy and military force to match, England, during the medieval and early modern periods, came to rule over the smaller, independent kingdoms in Wales and parts of Ireland. Although, to the north, the Kingdom of Scotland remained a fiercely proud and independent nation who had bitterly and successfully resisted frequent invasions from its powerful southern neighbour. By the early 17th century, Elizabeth I of England had issued several trading and exploration commissions to English adventurers.
I don't know how to feel about Elizabeth I now, because we watched another history video on toilets, and I think Elizabeth I was the first one to have an actual toilet. Yes, I am talking about the toilets where you sit down and pee and do your things. She was the first one to have a toilet, and she had it for many years and didn't tell anyone how the toilet works. So everybody else was still stuck sitting on pots and cups to do their deeds, while she had a whole bathroom and probably someone to clean her too. So girl was holding some information. I don't know how to feel about that.
With the intention of exploring and colonizing new territories yet to be claimed by other European powers.
Was it Elizabeth I? I think so.
The likes of Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher.
Sorry, I'll be quiet for a while now. I'm sorry. Interesting plot twist. Was he the one to tell everybody about the toilet?
Became the king of both Scotland establish overseas colonies that were to be ruled and governed under one of the three types of colony structures. A crown colony was directly ruled by the monarch themselves, but would typically be administered by a royally appointed governor and supported by a local council. A charter colony was similar to a crown colony, but was ruled under a corporate charter rather than a governor. These charter colonies often granted colonists significantly more political liberty compared to other colonies. A proprietary colony was governed by an individual who was typically the head of a joint stock company. These colonies were distinct from crown colonies in that they were commercial enterprises with responsibilities to shareholders. Proprietary governors typically did not live in the colony, and so appointed local governors and councils to rule in their absence. Over time, however, these proprietary colonies became increasingly difficult to manage and transitioned to crown colonies instead. An important yet
I mean, I was already confused by these three different colonies. I mean, no.
and transitioned to crown colonies instead. An important yet often overlooked development in England's overseas expansion is that of the plantation of Ulster, which saw Protestant settlers from Scotland and England transported to parts of the north of Ireland during the early years of King James's reign. This model of organised colonisation would form the blueprint for future English colonial expansion, with many of the leaders of the Ulster plantation later becoming involved in establishing other colonies in the New World. Throughout the 1600s, the Kingdom of England expanded its overseas colonies in North America and the Caribbean. Some were entirely new ventures, whereas others were annexed from rival foreign powers, like New York, which was seized from the Dutch in 1665.
I don't know if toilets were a thing in the 1600s. You guys must love watching me. I'm just making the whole video about the whole British Empire about toilets. But I just felt like that was very touching information for me. Like, it traumatized me a little bit that someone has a toilet and doesn't tell anyone else how a toilet works. So
England also significantly developed its trading networks in Africa and the East Indies, with the building of factories and fortified trading posts. A critical component to this mercantile success was the creation of the Royal African Company in 1660, who, over the subsequent decades, would become the leading participant in the brutal yet highly lucrative transatlantic slave trade. During this period, Scotland also began to establish overseas colonies of its own, having looked on somewhat enviously at the successful endeavours of the English. Unfortunately, almost all these attempts ended in failure, with colonies in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton and Carolina barely lasting a few years. The most abject failure of Scotland's colonisation attempts, however, came in 1698, with the Darien Scheme. This aimed to establish a colony controlling the overland trade route of the Isthmus of Panama between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To finance the expedition, an immense amount of capital was raised from the public, which accounted for almost a fifth of the wealth in Scotland at that time.
wow.
When the ships arrived at the coast of Darien, they named the colony Caledonia and set about constructing a settlement called New Edinburgh. The attempts of the colonists, however, were to ultimately prove futile, as the settlement quickly succumbed to food shortages, tropical disease, and attacks from nearby Spanish forces. Despite a resupply in 1699, the settlement was abandoned, and the survivors, who totaled just a few hundred of the original 2,500, returned to Scotland in disgrace. Due to the total disaster of the Darien Scheme and the loss of public money that had been invested into it, Scotland was plunged into a financial crisis. Many then considered that their best and only chance of being part of a major power would be to share in the benefits of England's colonial enterprise. By the turn of the 18th century, England and Scotland remained independent kingdoms, although The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had dramatically shifted the political landscape within the British Isles. The Catholic James II was deposed and replaced with his Protestant daughter Mary, and
I'm a little bit confused by the fact that the
Catholic James
King of England was the same as for Scotland, but they have completely different kind of ways to operate. Like, how did that work? If there was one leader for both countries, or
James II was its French counterpart across the subcontinent. The aftermath of the Battle of Plassey in 1757 wrestled control of Bengal away from the local Nawab ruler and his French allies, leaving the British to become the leading military and political power in the region. This acted as a springboard for the British East India Company to expand its territory further in later years, either assuming direct rule themselves or via local rulers who were
also, can someone explain to me why they go so far from their land? Like, it's very spread out everywhere, which is kind of confusing.
either assuming direct rule themselves or via local rulers who were threatened with force from the company's private armies. Further conflicts of the 18th century, namely the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War in particular, gifted Britain even further territorial concessions at the expense of her rivals. In North America, the British captured Quebec in 1759. And effectively ended French colonial efforts on the continent with the annexation of New France by 1760. Florida passed into British control from Spain, leaving virtually the entire eastern seaboard of North America in British hands. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War in 1763, also ceded the Caribbean islands of Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines, as well as Tobago, to Britain, which was now the most dominant colonial and maritime power of the age. Throughout its history, the British Empire would be powered by two components that went hand in hand with one another. Firstly, mastery of the high seas through naval supremacy, and secondly, indomitable mercantile trade that was free from foreign aggression. This exponential increase in trade gained immense wealth for Britain through the taxation of goods that passed through its ports. However, the issue of taxation itself would soon lead to revolution and the first major colonial loss for the empire. Although Britain considered its colonies to be sovereign territory, it did not afford them the same rights and privileges which were enjoyed on the British mainland. Throughout the 1760s and 1770s, relations between Britain and its 13 colonies in America became increasingly strained due to Parliament taxing the colonies without their consent or representation. Many within the 13 colonies considered this a breach of their rights as Englishmen and formally renounced the authority of Parliament in 1775, resulting in the outbreak of revolution. Britain sent troops to quell the rebelling colonists, but in the following year of 1776, the leading political figures of the colonies assembled to form the Second Continental Congress and declared their independence from Britain.
Wow.
After a protracted war of 8 years, Britain's military forces in the colonies were finally defeated, and the United States of America was recognized as an independent nation.
I'm sure I've heard this before, but maybe not like this. Okay.
Loss of America marked a sea change for the British Empire. After this, British colonial efforts shifted towards Asia, the Pacific, and Africa, where explorers had charted many new lands yet to be colonized by Europeans. One such explorer was Captain James Cook, who mapped and claimed
I wish there was a more specific video telling how this actually works in in real life, like in real time, because this does explain how it progressed and how it changed quite well, but not kind of how this is how does this actually happen, you know? Because it just looks like they're like taking parts from literally everywhere, and it's impressive, but just confusing.
war part of secured further territory from the defeated French, Spanish, and Dutch, who had been part of Napoleon's French Empire. The Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Ceylon, and the Cape Colony were added to Britain's already substantial number of colonies. Many of these Caribbean colonies contained countless plantations dedicated to the production of sugarcane, which, over the centuries, had become exclusively reliant on slave labour. Although Britain had already profited tremendously from the transatlantic slave trade, the advent of the Industrial Revolution shifted the focus of merchants and capitalists to produce goods at home in Britain, rather than relying on slave-produced goods from the colonies. Additionally, growing political pressure from abolitionist groups eventually forced the hand of the British government to abolish the slave trade within the empire in 1807. It would be another 27 years, however, before the institution of slavery itself would be formally abolished in 1834. The period from 1815 to 1914 has often been described as Britain's imperial century. After effectively seizing control over the Indian subcontinent, the British East India Company looked to expand its interests further across Asia. Singapore was founded as a trading post in 1819 and later incorporated as a colony in 1824. Whereas in China, the East India Company alongside the British government, were able to seize control of Hong Kong and Shanghai in the aftermath of the First Opium War in 1842. The East India Company's control over India itself, however, was challenged in 1857, when local troops rebelled against their British commanders. In what became known as the Sepoy Rebellion, the East India Company fought against troops previously under its command and retook the territories that had been seized by the mutineers. After the hostilities ended the following year, the British government decided to dissolve the East India Company, believing that it could no longer rule and administer the country effectively. India was then brought under direct British rule in 1858 and became the most valuable possession within the empire.
Why is this also new information for me? I wonder if you can still see, or like how does it reflect nowadays in India that this was a thing, you know?
Colloquially named as the jewel in the crown. An emerging threat to Britain's imperial ambitions during the 19th century came from the Russian Empire, which wished to expand its territorial possessions and sphere of influence into Central Asia and the Mediterranean, to fill the void of the collapsing Ottoman Empire. When Russia invaded the Ottoman-controlled Balkans in 1853, Britain, alongside France, entered the war in support of the Turks, fearing that Russia could threaten their colonial interests in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The resulting Crimean War of 1854 to 1856 was a resounding defeat for Russia and a confidence boost for the British, who remained the dominant global imperial power. Although the situation between Britain and Russia in Central Asia remained uncertain, a partial settlement to the issue, known as the Great Game, was reached in 1878, which established respective spheres of influence. The British also gained control of Cyprus from the Ottomans that year, as a surety it would be used to defend against any further Russian expansion. The continent of Africa also witnessed a consolidation of British colonial power during the 19th century. British immigration to the recently acquired Cape Colony began to increase in the 1820s, which pushed out thousands of Dutch-descended settlers, known as Boers, into the northern hinterland. Resentful of British rule, they established their own independent republics, namely the Transvaal and Orange Free State, but these two eventually succumbed to British occupation with the conclusion of the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1902.
In 1902, that was like yesterday. It's crazy to see how fast it expanded and how fast it deteriorated. Deteriorated.
Meanwhile, gained political independence from the mother country. Canada was formed into a confederation in 1867 and granted the right of full self-governance, with the exception to international relations. Australia and New Zealand followed similar paths in 1900, becoming newly created dominions of the empire. Ireland also hoped to gain some form of independence from Britain during this time. Multiple Home Rule bills were put before the British Parliament, but these were all defeated on the grounds that partial Irish independence would pose a threat to the unity of the empire.
But I'm confused. Do they just give them like their independence? Like, oh, you want to be independent? Okay. Or like, or is this like something you just do? I mean, wouldn't it take away from their empire for these places to be independent?
The threat to the empire, however, would ultimately come from Germany and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. During the conflict, Britain relied heavily on the empire for importing food, resources, and crucially, military support. Over 2.5 million men from Britain's dominions and colonies served in the First World War, with many from Canada, India, Australia, and New Zealand making the ultimate sacrifice for king and country. Britain was able to defeat Germany and its Ottoman allies in the war, and annexed much of their territory in the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific. Victory, however, came at a heavy price for Britain and signalled the beginning of the end for the empire. Although 1921 marked the peak of the British Empire's territorial possessions, Ireland was granted independence that same year, and soon other nations within the empire began to question when they may become independent also. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 put a temporary halt on this, as Britain once again turned to the empire for economic, material, and military support. Though ultimately victorious, Britain was bankrupted by the war and was no longer in a position to support its overstretched and questioning colonies. Gradually, throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the colonies and dominions of the empire were granted their independence from Britain. In what was recognised as the wind of change, almost 400 years of British colonial history came to an end. Although almost all these newly independent nations did not sever ties with Britain completely, and agreed to join the political association named the Commonwealth, with 14 of these nations also retaining the British monarch as their respective head of state. Perhaps what many see as the final and most symbolic representation of the end of the British Empire came in 1997, when Britain formally handed over Hong Kong to China. The legacy of the empire, however, remains with us to this day, as the English language is the most widely spoken on Earth, and British culture, practices, and customs remain universally popular.
1997?
Modern Britain itself can even be seen as a microcosm of the empire, with people of almost every race, nationality, religion, and culture that were once under British rule, now living on the very island that began the journey of empire all those years ago.
Wow, I have a lot to learn, guys. I have a lot to learn. After my toilet talk, I went into learning mode because that was a lot. And Hong Kong, I had no idea that happened in 1997, so like not long ago at all. A few years before I was born. How crazy is that? Either way, guys, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I really hope you liked it. Please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!